And Secretary of War Hegseth really had no plan other than, as President Trump put it, to bomb Iran into the millions have been killed in these strikes. On average, 10 children a day have been killed in U.S.-Israeli airstrikes. President Trump is now in the remarkable position of closing the Strait of Hormuz himself, supposedly for the stated purpose of opening it. And for those of us who were here in the Vietnam years, Netanyahu assured him, no problem. You bomb, we bomb, the regime will collapse. You bomb, we bomb, the Strait of Hormuz will stay open. President Trump accepted that advice and rejected the advice of his own cabinet officials who called that for what it.
I recognize the senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, we're now 46 days into President Trump's war on Iran and Lebanon. This war is wrong. This war is hurting the United States, our citizens, and our security. This war is destabilizing the Middle East, spreading to Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Jordan, and of course, not to mention Lebanon. This war has imperiled our economy, imposing unsustainable burdens on the American family. The average American family will pay $2,000 for gas more each year if prices stay this high. The average Vermont household will pay another $1,000 to heat their home this year. Farms across rural America are going to pay tens of thousands of dollars extra for fertilizer because of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The war is imperiling our world economy. The IMF has concluded that the growth in the economy around the world could drop by 2%, risking a global recession. Food prices are increasing around the world. In Sudan, the price for wheat is up 70% because of the war, and that's in a country on the brink of absolute starvation. And how did this happen? How did it happen? We got here because the president did disregard his own promises of staying out of Middle East wars. He disregarded the American people by not leveling with them about what his plan was, his intentions were. He disregarded Congress entirely, and he's totally disregarded our allies. So is it any surprise that we find ourselves right now with President Trump stuck dealing with this situation that he created pretty much by himself? Instead of consulting with our allies or even his own administration, the president relied on Prime Minister Netanyahu, inviting him to the Situation Room. Never been done before. Netanyahu assured him, no problem. You bomb, we bomb, the regime will collapse. You bomb, we bomb, the Strait of Hormuz will stay open. President Trump accepted that advice and rejected the advice of his own cabinet officials who called that for what it was. The Netanyahu advice was farcical. We've seen what happened. Oil has gone from $70 a barrel to a high of more than $120 a barrel. Fertilizer prices have jumped from $400 a ton to $700 a ton. And helium prices, which none of us really thought much about, they've gone up 100%.
Right here is where the argument sharpens into something much bigger than politics. It becomes about consequences. The speaker isn't just criticizing a decision. He's laying out a chain reaction. From one strategic call to rising oil prices, to fertilizer spikes, to global supply chain disruption. And notice the framing. This isn't abstract policy anymore. It's hitting everyday life, from gas prices to farming to tech production. The key tension? A decision that was supposed to stabilize the region is now being presented as triggering wider instability. So the question becomes, was this a miscalculation or a complete breakdown in judgment?
And that has created an enormous supply chain crisis for the semiconductor industry upon which all of us are dependent. You know, President Trump is now in the remarkable position of closing the Strait of Hormuz himself, supposedly for the stated purpose of opening it. And for those of us who were here in the Vietnam years, that's very reminiscent of the administration position that we had to destroy a village in order to save it. And it's just become indisputably clear that the President and Secretary of War Hegseth really had no plan other than, as President Trump put it, to bomb Iran into the Stone Age. And it is what is happening. The bombing has been among the most intense bombing campaigns in the history of air warfare. The U.S. has carried out more than 13,000 airstrikes. Israel has carried out more than 10,000 strikes, dropping over 18,000 bombs. In the first 100 hours, the U.S. and Israel hit more targets in Iran than in the first 6 months of the bombing campaign against ISIS. These strikes have had a devastating toll on civilians and clearly civilian targets. Just talk about in Iran, U.S.-Israeli strikes have hit 60 hospitals, 44 schools, including that girls' school that was horrifying to all of us. The major B1 highway bridge used by civilians, killing 13 civilians. Major pharmaceutical plants that were producing anti-cancer drugs and had associated with them 200,000 jobs. Desalinization plants, sports stadiums, Tehran's synagogue. And Mr. President, while the President says the Iranian people are not our adversary, thousands of civilians have been killed in these strikes. On average, 10 children a day have been killed in U.S.-Israeli airstrikes. Nearly 40% of the attacks have taken place in the heart of Tehran, a dense urban area, and 95% of those killed by bombs are civilians. This kind of bombing tells us that President Trump has made the Iranian people, the very people he promised to save, the adversary, the enemy, much more so than the Ayatollahs. Mr. President, it is time to end this war of choice, this war that was chosen by a very intemperate decision by our president, this war that is making Americans less secure, and this war that is and will continue to impose extraordinary economic pain on our citizens. Mr. President, it's very clear that President Trump and his negotiators, Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner, have a fundamental misunderstanding of the regime they are dealing with. In the course of this war, President Trump has changed the narrative. 3 months ago, we were focused on the violence of the Iranian regime towards its own people. Today, with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the economic pain that the Ayatollahs have been able to inflict on the world, the narrative is about the Ayatollahs standing up to the U.S. and Israel. Trump's bombing has damaged Iran, and it's hurt the Iranian people. But it's also given everyone in the Ayatollahs leverage over our economy and the world economy. The threats that the president makes to the Ayatollahs don't particularly move them, and it's something he doesn't understand. This is not a real estate deal. What the Ayatollahs have shown, and this is horrifying, is that they are prepared to destroy their own country if that's what it takes for them to stay in power. So these threats that the president makes fall on deaf ears. Mr. President, as a first step in ending this war, I urge my colleagues to support Senator Sanders' joint resolutions of disapproval, which we will be taking up later today. Those resolutions would stop the United States from sending bombs, thousands of bombs, and armored bulldozers to Israel. These weapons are paid for by the American taxpayers. We will be sending bombs to Israel at a time we're in a ceasefire, which I hope will continue. These bulldozers are being used literally to bulldoze entire villages in Lebanon on behalf of Israel's intentions. And I want to note that if this vote is successful on the JRDs, it would simply force a debate. It wouldn't stop anything. It would require those of us in the United States Senate, those of us who by virtue of our election have the Article I authority to declare war. It would require us to say yes or no on where we stand. It would require us to accept our responsibility under the Constitution to do our job on the most profound question that affects the people of this country, and that is when, whether, and why to commit this country to war. Mr. President, I hope my colleagues will vote in favor of these JRDs, and I'm disappointed that we rejected Senator Duckworth's resolution herself. We need this ceasefire to continue. We need the bombing to stop and stay stopped. Mr. President, I yield back.
What you just heard is not just a policy disagreement. It's a full-scale indictment of how this war was started, how it's being executed, and what it's costing, not just abroad, but at home. The most revealing thread running through this entire speech is the idea of contradiction. A war framed as stabilizing the region is instead described as spreading instability across multiple countries. A strategy meant to weaken adversaries is portrayed as strengthening their leverage over the global economy. And perhaps most strikingly, a campaign that claims to target regimes is being framed as disproportionately harming civilians, the very people it was supposedly meant to help. But beyond the moral argument, there's a deeper institutional critique here. The speaker is clearly arguing that this wasn't just a bad outcome. It was a broken process. No meaningful consultation with allies. A dismissal of internal advice. Congress sidelined. And instead, reliance on a narrow set of external assurances that, according to this account, failed dramatically. That raises a serious question about decision-making at the highest level. When critical choices are made without broad input or accountability, are we seeing strategy or improvisation? Then there's the economic angle, which is where this really hits home for viewers. Rising gas prices, higher heating costs, increased farming expenses, supply chain disruptions. These aren't abstract geopolitical consequences. They're direct impacts on everyday life. And by connecting those dots, the speech reframes foreign policy as something deeply personal, something that reaches into households, not just headlines. Another powerful moment comes when the narrative shift is described. Initially, the focus was on the internal actions of the Iranian regime. But now, according to this argument, the global story has changed. The regime is being repositioned, not necessarily as justified, but as defiant, standing up under pressure. That's a significant claim, because it suggests that the war may have unintentionally reshaped global perception in a way that benefits the very actors it sought to weaken. And finally, the constitutional argument brings everything back to accountability. The call for debate isn't framed as obstruction, it's framed as responsibility. Who decides when a nation goes to war? Who answers for the consequences? And what happens when those lines are blurred? At its core, this speech is forcing a difficult question onto the table. If the strategy produces the opposite of its intended outcomes, more instability, more economic pain, more global risk, then what exactly is the path forward? Now I want to hear from you. Do you think this argument holds up? Was this a failure of strategy, execution, or leadership? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more sharp political analysis that actually connects the dots.